Welcome to the largest anti-war gathering anywhere in the world. 1.3 million people were at our last meeting for all or for part of what was an immensely important, if broadcast, convocation of voices of different political stripes. A point I wish to stress again. We may agree on nothing else, or on only a little else, or we may agree on almost everything. The important thing is that we want to stop the wars, actually, and to identify NATO as being at the heart of the war machine in the world, of the never-ending wars, the everlasting wars, the continuous eruption of wars. And we bring together the broadest possible coalition of people behind those two demands. And that's important because not everyone takes that approach. No one has to take an ideological blood test to be on our platform. No one has to agree one with the other on any other matter other than the need to stop the wars. No one gets airbrushed. No one is subject to sectarian shadow banning or strangulation or no platforming or banning of any kind. And that's what distinguishes No to NATO, No to War from others in the field. And it's the reason, I think, why our audience is growing and growing and growing to the 1.3 million in the last meeting. Some may ask, what's the locus of NATO in the current war and the current ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip? Well, take a look through your binoculars at the crowded sea lanes in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are chock full of the warships of the members of NATO. Take a look at the arms shipments that are being made to resupply the murderous Israeli assault on 2.3 million people, fewer now than there were just 4 weeks ago, just a month ago, but still 2.3 million people being shot like fish in a barrel, and not by blunderbuss, but by the most sophisticated, most deadly warplanes that the world has ever seen, being bombarded from the sea by the Israeli Navy and now invaded on the ground by the so-called Israel Defense Force. All the weapons that were used and are now being resupplied came from NATO countries, principally, of course, the United States of America, but by no means exclusively so. If the United States is villain number one, if we were to produce that proverbial pack of cards of the villainy, then the United States would undoubtedly be villain number one. But the United Kingdom follows closely behind as villain number two. And indeed, almost all of the NATO countries are now jointly, severally responsible for what has turned into an almost unprecedented bloodbath, at least in modern times, at least in the times when people could watch live on video the massacres taking place. Millions of people, tens, maybe hundreds of millions, are doing so right at this minute. And it's a horrifying sight indeed. If you want to take a look at where your special forces are, if you are lucky enough to live in a country where that kind of parliamentary question would be answered, you'd discover that the British special forces are on the fence between Israel and Gaza, but may very well be inside that fence. You may discover, as I did to my surprise, that the Netherlands has Marines and they've sent them. They can spare them, you see. We didn't know they had them. They've sent them to Cyprus to be on hand for a fighting role in what may yet become a wider war. It is apparently the intention of the Israeli government, of Benjamin Netanyahu, that the war should spread. And I'll turn to that in just a minute. But first, I've got to indict the NATO countries. Now, not just for their role in the cruel bombardment, mainly of women and children, who make up the great majority of the gigantic level of death and wounded that has been the story of the last month. Gaza is 50% populated by children, children who've never voted in any election for any party, children that by definition had no part in any breakout of the concentration camp that took place on October the 7th. Children who have never handled weapons but are being massacred in a classic terrorist action, a definition of terrorism being the harming of innocent people for what you say are the crimes of guilty people. Another item that I intend to turn to. But the NATO countries are now not just responsible for the role in the slaughter of the innocents from the air and from the sea. They are now complicit in a days that will live in infamy. The pitiful sight of tens of thousands of people, perhaps 50,000 people, with their hands on their head, with their hands in the air, with their little children holding white tissue papers in the air, being marched at gunpoint and being monitored closely by the muzzles of powerful tanks as they made an exodus from the north of Gaza to God knows where. I have no idea where that 50,000 slept last night or will sleep tonight. There are certainly no houses for them. There are certainly no tanks for them, no tents. There are certainly no supplies of water or food or medicine. They are tonight in the open air in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, having been marched there at gunpoint in an act of ethnic cleansing as brazen, as lurid as any that have been seen in recent times. They were scenes redolent, of course, of the original catastrophe, Nakba, that occurred in 1948, when 800,000 Palestinians were similarly marched, stampeded from their land, from their houses, never ever to return. And the 50,000 that left yesterday for yet another exile in the open air in the southern part of Gaza may very well never ever return to the rubble, the hovels that they have been eking out a painful existence on the bitter earth of the Gaza Strip. They may never return again. But where shall they go? Is it the intention to drive them into the sea? Or is it the intention to drive them into the desert? It's all sounding very biblical, this, I know, but it looks rather biblical to me. And the countries of the NATO alliance, who are in lockstep, defensive maneuver in defense of this Israeli action, are now jointly and severally responsible for it. They are responsible for the 10,000 deaths, and now they are responsible for the more than 50,000 refugees that left their existing refugee existence into yet another refugee existence. This is ethnic cleansing. The kind of ethnic cleansing that we were told in the Chicago Doctrine, in the speeches of Blair and Clinton, were the reason for the conjuring up of the so-called RTP, the right to protect. You'll recall it in Yugoslavia. That's the reason NATO entered the war in Yugoslavia, because they had a right, a duty, they said, to protect the refugees that were fleeing from the fighting between Serbia and the secessionist forces in the Kosovo Liberation Army. Well, what about these refugees? Who will protect them? Who will even ask for, never mind demand, a ceasefire so that water and food can be given to the condemned men, women, and children before they are later slaughtered? As Professor Finkelstein put it, the fattening of the pig, or as someone else put it, the giving of a cigarette to the man stood before the firing squad. Even that has not been demanded by the leaders of the NATO powers. In fact, Joe Biden this afternoon was asked, what are the possibilities of a ceasefire? And he answered brazenly, none, no possibilities. So there we have it. There is no possibility, according to President Biden, of this coming to an end, even temporarily, for the supply of water to a population now dying of thirst, dying of hunger, dying from bombs and bullets and missiles and shells. I tell you, we've never seen anything like this. There have been things like this, but we were never able to watch them actually happening and be apparently powerless to do anything about it. But we are not powerless, because we live in countries where whatever other democratic liberties are being shredded, the right to vote remains, for the time being at least, extant. And the Dutch government has to be elected in 10 days' time. There's almost certainly an election coming in Portugal. There's an election coming in Britain, and there's an election coming in the United States of America. And we all have a duty to mobilize millions of our compatriots to tell the political class that they will never be forgiven for that which they have done, and that any politician who is not up on their feet roaring for an end to this murder and siege can forget about your vote, can forget about your support in the next or any subsequent election. That's kind of all we've got left. The threat to our political class that they are not doing this in our name, and up with it, we will not put, at least not willingly, at least not quietly. Well, the gathering of speakers that we have in this No to NATO, No to War meeting this evening is certainly not quiet. Their eloquence and their courage in facing up to the slings and arrows of outrageous smear, which is the fate of those of us who have long stood for Palestinian rights, is something to behold. None more so than our first speaker this evening, my former parliamentary colleague, one of the first living martyrs to the weaponization of the foul smear of anti-Semitism, is Chris Williamson, a distinguished member of Parliament, and I'm proud to say now with me a member of the Workers' Party of Britain. Chris Williamson, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed for that introduction, George, and I'm very proud to be standing with you on this platform this evening, and proud to be working with you in the Workers' Party. And as you say, we're not entirely powerless. People do have a vote. And there is an election coming up next year. And there will be an opportunity, I think, for people to express their horror, their revulsion at the political class. And certainly the Workers' Party will be fielding candidates. And I'm hopeful that we'll get a coalition of anti-war socialist candidates, not necessarily in the Workers' Party, but in other parties perhaps, but outside the Labour Party, that will give people a genuine alternative choice. Very difficult in the first past the post system, but we have to do it, and it's not impossible. It's been done before. The Labour Party was born at a time when the political duopoly was between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party, and the Labour Party was founded because it was felt that the Liberal Party was no longer representing the interests of ordinary working people, and the trade union movement, as you know, George, founded the Labour Party, and it was a couple of decades, but there we are. A couple of decades went by, 24 years to be precise, and we had the first Labour government. It wasn't a great Labour government; it was a minority Labour government, and they didn't push through the sort of agenda that I would have liked to have seen. And I think the Labour Party has been infected with far too many throughout its entire history, really, in Parliament of MPs, of leading MPs anyway, or more insistence on and keen to placate the establishment than they are to actually deliver a progressive socialist and anti-imperialist agenda. But let me just start really by just a little anecdote, really, talking about the media, and I had a spat with Julia Hartley-Brewer, one of the mainstream media hacks, yesterday. I was invited onto her show to talk about the situation in Gaza at the moment, and I was just confronted with interruptions. I was hectored throughout. The woman completely lost the plot, in my opinion. But what was interesting was that she repeated the foul lies, which I think you alluded to in your opening remarks, George. And when I corrected her to say that the allegations that the resistance fighters were guilty of rape, of beheading babies, had all been debunked, she just completely threw her toys out of the pram and went absolutely ballistic, and was unwilling to accept the reality. And she indulged in a number of ad hominem insults at me, saying I'm taking money from Iran because I present a program about Palestine on a weekly basis, Palestine Declassified, which is hosted on Press TV, which is the radio broadcasting company. But she went on to make all sorts of ridiculous allegations, like, for example, Iran wants to eradicate all Jewish people from the planet. When I pointed out to her, or when I asked her, should I say, where the biggest Jewish population lived outside Israel in the Middle East, she didn't know. And when I pointed out that it was actually in Iran, she didn't have much to say about that. But the point is that she was kind of portraying, this sort of ridiculous caricature of the Palestinian resistance as savages, and making all sorts of assertions about the savagery that they allegedly inflicted on the people when they made that incursion into what should be Palestine. But the truth of it is, of course, and you'll know this, George, that many of the fatalities were actually at the hands of the Israeli occupation forces. There is a interesting protocol called the Hannibal Directive. It's an official protocol that has been adopted by the Israeli military for some years, and it's basically to ensure that hostages are never taken, even if that means killing your own people. And it seems to me that the Hannibal Directive was invoked on this occasion, because when some of the resistance fighters were holed up in some of the buildings on that kibbutz, with some of the Israelis there, they were fired at by tanks, and the destruction was obviously by the tank shells. And these were then shown as if it was the resistance fighters that were responsible for these terrible scenes. But of course, that wasn't the case. So similarly with the vehicles on the roads, as the resistance fighters were taking some of the people that they captured, back to Gaza, they were taken out by Apache helicopters in airstrikes. So this is something, which the corporate media just simply are unwilling to actually talk about, with the notable exception of Al Jazeera. And that's why it's so uplifting, so good to have. Well, it's great to have Al Jazeera, of course, but it's great to have these alternative independent media platforms. Yours is an excellent one, George, of course, with your multi-million viewership. But there are many, many other smaller ones as well, a plethora of them. And they are really, really important, it seems to me, in actually, getting the message out about what is really happening in Palestine, in Gaza right now, but also on a whole host of other issues as well, whether it be corporate state power, the abuse of corporate power, and the abuse of state power. And these were things that, of course, Julian Assange was very motivated by. And it's interesting because, Julian was scathing, wasn't he, about the role of journalists. And he asked a question in a famous speech he made when he said, what is the average death count attributed to each journalist? And he went on to say that journalists are war criminals because they are responsible for, if you like, manufacturing consent for war. And, Chomsky made that point, didn't he, about manufacturing consent. And I think those points that Julian made are incredibly well made, in fact, because, the mainstream media do, in my opinion, have a lot to answer, but they're not getting it all their own way. And it's interesting as well, isn't it, that the same people that were cheerleading NATO's proxy war are cheerleading Israel's genocide in Gaza right now. And it's been said, hasn't it, that, the first casualty of war is truth. I mean, if it was down to the media, they'd have us believe that history started in Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, when Russia started its special military operation. They silent about the fact that there was a civil war going on for 8 years that was started after the US and the EU backed a coup and overthrew the democratically elected president of Ukraine and installed a puppet regime. And they immediately banned the Russian language in the country where 1 in 3 people's first language is Russian. And then effectively started a bombardment, a civil war against the people of East Ukraine, led by literal Nazis who have been incorporated into the Ukrainian military. Quite astonishing, really, when you think about it. And particularly when, as we often hear, well, the president, Zelensky, is a Jew. How can you talk about that they're actually supporting Nazis? But we know that's the reality. And I know you've spoken about this a number of occasions on your Moat show as well, George. But of course, the provocations which the mainstream media don't talk about. The Bucharest Declaration in 2008, and the very fact that Gorbachev was promised in 1991, I think it was, that the NATO would not expand 1 inch beyond the unified border of Germany, and then, of course, as we know, it more or less doubled in size. We don't hear either, do we, about the fact that Russia put on the table a peace and security plan for Europe 2 months, I think, before the special military operation started, and just dismissed out of hand and didn't give it the time of day. Ridiculous state of affairs. And we know that, they were gagging for war. I mean, and I've made this point on a number of occasions previously as well, where we've got, high ups in the Atlantic Council, which is the de facto think tank for NATO, talking about the strategic case for risking war with Russia. So we know it's been on the cards for some time. It was provoked and they were pushed into it. But you mentioned the right to protect, the responsibility to protect, that doctrine that was used erroneously, in my opinion, by the West in a number of occasions. The last time I seem to remember it being put forward by a British Prime Minister was when David Cameron was seeking the authority of Parliament to bomb Syria. He actually got turned over on that occasion. But, if you think about the responsibility to protect, if you like, a third party, well, Russia certainly had a much more arguable case to intervene in Ukraine, when you consider that 8,000 people had lost their lives in the 8-year war that Zelensky's military were amassing on the border of the Donbass just before the special military operation, ready for a huge onslaught. But there's been effectively a media blackout about all of that. And so we've been very, very badly let down, it seems to me, by the corporate media who seem to take their orders from NATO. And as far as, history beginning on a certain date, when you look at the way in which the media are covering the situation in Palestine right now, in Gaza at the moment, it's as if, nothing happened before the 7th of October when the Al-Aqsa flood incursion took place. And we've, all about these lurid accusations, which, as I've already mentioned, have been debunked. But, no talk about the 75 years of oppression and terrorism that's been inflicted on the Palestinian people since Israel was established in 1948, and of course then expanded still further in 1967 in that war that took place at that time. And then they occupied and continued to illegally occupy the land that they took at that point in time. That's over 50 odd years now, isn't it? It's got a lifetime for many people. And pogroms which are going on. I mean, often we talk here about pogroms, about Jews in the past being subject to pogroms. But, these illegal settlers in the West Bank, we're not hearing much about that. If you listen to these independent media platforms, if you listen to Al Jazeera, you will hear about it. But there's a lot of oppression right now and violence going on in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. I mean, the scale of loss of life is nowhere near as great. But nevertheless, I think it's 170 odd Palestinians have now lost their lives at the hands of these crazy illegal settlers and the Israeli military, which often, are supporting and assisting in these pogroms, which are now taking place on a regular basis, and people are being snatched by the Israeli security forces on a regular basis, snatched off the street, being taken into administrative detention. I think there's over 2,000 people now in administrative detention, and that number's rising all the time, being thrown into Israeli dungeons with no due process, no charge, and they can be kept there for years on end. And what's that if it's not a hostage situation? And, people say, Julia Hartley-Brewer, for example, was talking about the hostages that are being held by the resistance in Gaza at the moment. Well, Hamas has made it clear all of these hostages that they took can be released in exchange for the hostages that Israel has. That seems to me a reasonable deal. But again, we're not hearing this from the mainstream media. One of the things that really shocked me, and I shouldn't be shocked really, given what we know about Zionism, but the Mizkov Institute is saying that they can use the situation in Gaza right now. And indeed, they published a report only recently, actually, effectively talking about a final solution to completely evacuate the entirety of Gaza. Wipe them out, as you were saying, George, push them into the desert, push them into the sea, push them anywhere, but basically to free up Gaza for use by Israel. And what the media is doing is running cover for this genocidal, appalling regime that we have in Israel right now. But the genocide that was spoken of by the Mizkov Institute, I mean, it's been part of a grand plan, hasn't it? I mean, if you think back in time, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, wrote a letter in 1937 saying that we'll expand, these are his words, we'll expand to the whole land of Israel, as he put it. They kind of accepted those borders in 1948 on sufferance, if you like, but always the intention was to expand well beyond that to, as he said, the whole of the land of Israel, basically to the whole of Palestine. But if we think the corporate media,
more than all of Palestine, Chris, they intended, if they can, and who knows if they will in the end be able to expand into all of Lebanon and all of Jordan. They believe that all of that is part of their greater Israel. I'll stop you there, Chris, because of the other speakers. A very, very powerful address. I thank you for it. I want to bring in the second speaker, David Clews of Unity Network News, who has also been facing the slings and arrows, albeit from a different political constituency. He's one of those who has actually remained true to the attitude struck over the last few years by some of the people now attacking him. He stands up for freedom of speech. He stands up for freedom of assembly. He stands up for the protection of the liberties which our fathers and grandfathers fought for in 2 world wars. And we commemorate that, David, don't we, on this Saturday and Sunday. Welcome, David Clews, to the No2Nato, No to War meeting this evening.
Well, George, thank you very much for such a kind introduction, and it is always a pleasure to be with you. And yes, these are important things, the freedoms and liberties that were fought for, that are so far away and removed from what we once had. And as you said correctly, when the event started on October the 7th, I remembered vividly back to March 2020 with the terror that people were put into over videos of people dropping dead on the streets of China, which proved to then be untrue. And then there was a whole big campaign there. And then fast forward to February 2022, the scenes coming out of Ukraine, and there was this, all of a sudden there was a war starting there. And so the way I kind of look at it is this isn't my first rodeo, and most certainly with yourself, I know you've had a long-standing commitment in the Middle East conflict and the Middle East in general, and I think it's important to say, George, that you have been proven absolutely correct over the decades with your stance on the Middle East. When you were so viciously slandered in the early 1990s in relation to Saddam Hussein. And I think many people now look at that and think, my goodness, that man Galloway was onto something. Then the same with Colonel Gaddafi as well, but President Bashar al-Assad, the way they unsuccessfully managed to remove him. And it's all part of the same nexus. It's all part of the same thing. It's all about money. It's all about power. It's about control, and it is innocent, everyday people who are dying and suffering. And I think it's interesting because my politics, what we talk about, I sometimes don't go in for the left-right divide, but some people would say it was to the right. But what happened was you had maybe 2000 September 11th. So for about 5 years, you had a real fervor, and you had a clash of civilizations rhetoric, all of that kind of stuff. This was the West versus the barbarists of Islam, etc., etc. And then what happened was that kind of died down, and then the counter jihad movement appeared in the West, which was again pushing it. And I thought people had moved on from that, because people now realize that 9/11 wasn't what we were told, and the response to it certainly wasn't what we were told. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when they accused Saddam Hussein of supporting Al-Qaeda. And Saddam Hussein was one of the biggest opponents to true extremism you had in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein kicked these people out or put them in jail. He was an ally. So in order to stop terrorism, we had to then take out and kill the biggest opponent to terrorism in the Middle East, who represented a fundamentally secular vision of Arab nationalism. And I thought that had all been put to bed. And then what happened on October the 7th was all the old talking points just came rolling back out again. And Trump's pushing it, Biden's pushing it, everyone on the right in Britain, Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Katie Hopkins, Tommy Robinson, miraculously back on the scene on Twitter. Not that I'm against that, as you said, I do believe in free speech, and he should be there. But this counter jihad narrative was dead in the water. People were talking about they were exposing the deep state, but all of a sudden their brains have just gone back to sleep again. I just can't. I cannot fathom it out. But there is and I think what I would say to people who are looking at people like Nigel Farage, etc., who are really, and their behaviour's been disgusting. It has been provocative. It has been based on lies and really, really, really troubling stuff. I mean, I do believe we need to have serious conversations around issues like mass migration, around culture, etc. But they have been given free rein to demonize and attack people, belittle them. And what that then, they talk about the stages of genocide. That then results in babies and children being bombed and slaughtered in Gaza, and people are just not even upset about it. And I am just utterly disgusted by that somehow it's acceptable. And then the other one, people turn around and says, oh, well, Hamas did it, so Israel have a right to respond. Well, as Chris quite lightly pointed out, and as I've been saying, the October the 7th narrative is wrong. It is based on lies. We don't know what happened on October the 7th, but what we do know is that the Israeli government has media contacts and a unit, the Hasbara policies, that puts out these lies. So many of these things have been debunked. The 40 babies beheaded. There was an article today in the only people that are reporting on the lies of the Israeli government are in Israel. The Israeli, because Netanyahu's not popular. The Western media aren't covering it. So that then allowed them to facilitate, as you quite rightly point out, is amounting to ethnic cleansing. It is just beyond any morals. Now, Israel as a supposed state or in the UN, etc., has rules of engagement, has to follow international law. They have broken all sorts of international law, everything. And what they've done is they've taken a lot of people who would have been supporting Israel or who would have had sympathy for them, who are now utterly disgusted by them and just see them as beyond the pale. And they should really be beyond the... What they're doing is just never acceptable. Killing children like this, deliberately targeting civilians. It's just, to think that we're here in 2023 and this is going on is just disgusting. But then what the opposition will turn around and say is, but look at what Hamas did. Well, what did they do? What they have done is not what Netanyahu and Likud are telling you they have done. There is a fog of war.
Well, David, the truth of what happened on October 7th is beginning to emerge, and you are right to identify that it is emerging not from the Western press, but from the Israeli media and from the Israeli public, who are a switched on and internet savvy public. And the latest revelation is the actual footage from the Apache helicopters that were machine gunning people and vehicles at the festival, the music festival, where people were dancing almost within earshot of the anguish behind the wire in the refugee camp, the concentration camp called Gaza. A very significant number of people were killed on October the 7th. Most of them were Israeli military and security forces. Don't take my word for that. Take the word of the Israeli media for that, who've now published the names and rank and serial number of the 2/3 of the casualties who were Israeli military and security forces. And of the remaining 1/3, it is becoming more and more clear, as hostages told us from the beginning, that many of those, maybe most of those, were actually killed in pursuit of this Hannibal doctrine by Israeli armed elements themselves. Now, there were no rapes. That's just a brazen lie. No evidence has been adduced in 4 weeks of propaganda war to in any way justify that slander. There were not 40 beheaded babies. There's only one baby dead on October 7th. One. Who killed that baby is not yet at all clear. These lies have fueled a genocide. And those who keep repeating them, even when they're being debunked by Israeli people themselves, have a lot to answer for. David, I'll come back to you. Sorry, do you want to come in? Go ahead, come in.
I was just going to say, George, that it is so accurate, and that matters. And the burned bodies were as a result of the Apache helicopters that flew in and fired missiles, Hellfire missiles. They're called Hellfire missiles because they create a hellfire situation, and they have total control over it. And as you say, I knew something was wrong that day, that this wasn't real. And it's just come out as well today that media from Gaza accompanied the Hamas during their incursion. Therefore, if they knew it was going to go on, are you honestly trying to tell me the Israeli security apparatus, which is one of the most effective, the biggest in the world, didn't know? They just they just went to sleep all of a sudden. And again, I think we know that there, George, that people knew what was happening, and there was a blind eye turned to this to facilitate what we have.
David Clews, thank you very much. Last but by no means least is the fierce fighter for peace and justice, broadcaster, journalist, political activist, and one of my heroes in the United States of America, the one and only Katie Halper. Welcome to the platform of No to NATO, No to War. Katie, I think you're muted.
Sorry, what a metaphor for corporate censorship when it comes to this issue.
Go ahead.
But thank you so much for having me. I am here because I want to make it clear that NATO, the United States, and Israel do not represent me as an American and as a Jew. Israel likes to claim that it makes Jews safer. And as a Jew, I want to say that Israel does not make me safe. Israel makes me sick, and Israel makes me less safe because they are committing crimes against humanity in the name of Jews. Luckily, they don't actually speak for Jews, but of course they claim to. And Jews who speak out against Israel's crimes are the Jews who make me feel not only in good moral company, but also who make me feel safer. So the horrific images coming out of Gaza have shocked even those of us who follow the occupation and have been following it for years. The wiping out of entire families, the bombings of hospitals, and the clear attempt at ethnic cleansing and current ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. They are carrying out a genocide as we speak right now. And I'm ashamed that my government decided to censure the only Palestinian American member of Congress for daring to say that her people are human beings who don't deserve to be slaughtered. She is in good company, though, because the only other member of Congress ever censured was Joshua Reed Giddings, and he was censured for daring to speak out against slavery. She's also being supported by countless Americans, as well as citizens of the world who are up in arms that members of Congress are allowed to, from floors of Congress and the halls of Congress, they are allowed to compare Palestinian civilians to Nazis. They are allowed to celebrate Palestine being, quote, flattened into a parking lot, end quote. Nothing happens to these members of Congress. Nothing happens to the members of Congress who are supporting genocide. It's only the member of Congress who dares to call out genocide. I was fired and banned by The Hill in the fall of 2022 over a monologue I had written for a show there called Rising, which I had appeared on for over a year. I made a weekly appearance there. And in this monologue, I defended Rashida Tlaib and her claim that Israel was an apartheid state. And I laid out why Israel was an apartheid state. And for that, I was fired. And I would do that again because I stand with Rashida Tlaib. And I continue to stand with her as she's slandered and smeared for having a moral compass. It's painful today, but at least today there is a national day of action. While the New York Times may explain to us again and again why we should understand anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, which, by the way, is an anti-Semitic trope, which offends me as a humanitarian and an internationalist and a Jew, the idea that all Jews blindly support the state of Israel, that is an anti-Semitic trope that leans into the dual loyalty stereotype, and it's an extremely dangerous one. And I'm offended by that conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I think it's telling that the people who use the term anti-Zionist, the people who use the word Jew and Zionist interchangeably are raging anti-Semites who use those terms as if they're the same thing. And then the government of Israel, AIPAC, and the Anti-Defamation League, all those people, they should know that they're in good company with raging anti-Semites who also present Jews as Zionists, without question. And everyone who has been out at these protests have seen the vocal, vociferous presence of anti-Zionist Jews like me. I lost family members in the Holocaust. I also had family members who were killed fighting fascism in the Spanish Civil War and in World War II. I have family members who moved to Israel after the Holocaust, and I attended the Jewish Voice for Peace protest that shut down Grand Central Station last month. I joined the protest in front of Chuck Schumer's house, where brave people were arrested. People were arrested at the Grand Central Station protest. Also, I joined the protest which took over the Statue of Liberty just on Monday. And when I'm there, I'm so heartened to be there with college kids pushing for justice in Palestine, old cantankerous anti-war activists who know that the term war crime is redundant, and Holocaust survivors themselves who say never again for anyone, never again is now, ceasefire now and not in our name. And we're watching the brutal government of Netanyahu try to wipe out a people, but around the world, from huge demonstrations internationally that are too big to prohibit, to shutting down Grand Central Station, and the takeover of the Statue of Liberty, there are Palestinian brothers and sisters and Jewish grandmothers and grandfathers, and we're all in this together. They're trying to bomb something else in Gaza. They're trying their hardest to destroy the concept of an international law, a system of justice that extends beyond borders and states, that says there are crimes against humanity that we all must reject. Yesteryear, we had the Bush administration fighting the idea of an international criminal court. Today, we have Biden saying there is no chance of a ceasefire. That's some beautiful bipartisanship. There's a lot to criticize about the international system of justice or injustice. It is applied unfairly. It is a flawed system. Who is in the docket of The Hague? George Bush, Bill Clinton, Obama? How many weddings do you have to drone to get sent to The Hague? But something else has to be remembered, and something else will emerge from the sorrow and the grief. The international system of justice was created in the shadow of the Holocaust, and it was a human attempt to have a fair way to protect the oppressed from the awful powers of states hell-bent on ethnic cleansing and genocide. But what else was created out of the shadow of the Holocaust? NATO, a military alliance hell-bent on dividing and conquering the world. You do not have to look far into the history of NATO to see the fingerprints of veterans of World War II, the presence of veterans of Nazi Germany. This isn't a theory, it's history. And as one of the speakers mentioned, people will push back on the claim that there's a Nazi presence in Ukraine's government by pointing out that Zelensky is Jewish. But that doesn't mean there is no anti-Semitism there or Nazism there, just as having Obama, the president of the United States, did not get rid of racism. But there's also another history that emerged that we can reconnect with, and that's the history of anti-colonialism, of international solidarity, of socialists, Jews, and Arabs in the belly of the beast and across the global south, looking at each other in recognition of our shared humanity, in solidarity against this terrible crime, building together the world we all deserve in this movement and in this moment. We are all Gazans. Their pain is our pain. And Gaza makes it clear that NATO governments have no moral standing whatsoever. Just as NATO is complicit in the genocidal ethnic cleansing and wholesale slaughter of Palestinians, NATO is complicit in bloodshed in Ukraine. While NATO countries don't even pretend to care about Palestinians, they claim to care about Ukrainians, and yet we all know that that isn't true. If these governments cared about Palestinians or Ukrainians, they'd be calling for a ceasefire. But they're happy to see Palestinians slaughtered, and they're happy to use Ukrainians as cannon fodder in their proxy war with Russia. If they cared about Ukrainians, they wouldn't have poked the bear. The United States wouldn't have sent their errand boy, Boris Johnson, to scuttle negotiations between Putin and Zelensky in March of 2022. And I just want to add another thing, which is that there are reports that Zelensky is, quote, delusional and, quote, verging on messianic, end quote. And these aren't Putinist talking points. These come from Zelensky aides and Zelensky cheerleaders. So Simon Schuster wrote this fawning article about Zelensky, naming him Time Magazine's Person of the Year at the end of 2022. He wrote a follow-up at the beginning of this month, and Schuster describes Zelensky as, quote, hardened into a form that worries some of his advisors. He also describes Zelensky's faith as immovable, verging on the messianic. And one of Zelensky's closest aides tells Schuster he's, quote, delusional, we're out of options, we're not winning, but try telling him that, end quote. Just last night, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott and presidential candidate for at least another few weeks said at the debate, the Republican debate, I believe that ultimately we should make sure that the president of the United States, what is America's national vital interest in Ukraine, sees what America's national vital interest in Ukraine. It is actually in degrading the Russian military. We have been very effective using our resources and our weaponry and the incredibly high price of Ukrainian blood to achieve that objective. Every day we get closer to the degradation of the Russian military, end quote. That is what he said last night, and that is the logic of NATO, degrading Russia as America's adversary with European and U.S. bullets and Ukrainian blood. The rank hypocrisy of the West is clear in how they talk about genocide. Civilian deaths in 1 month of Israeli attacks on Gaza top the entire deaths of Russian-Ukrainian war toll. 10,022 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since October 7th, compared to 9,806 people in Ukraine since February 24th, 2022. And I want to be clear that I lament every death, whether it's in Palestine or Ukraine. But the West doesn't. My president throws around the term genocide when it comes to Ukraine, but refuses to use it where it's actually happened and is happening. And don't take my word for it. Listen to the Israeli historian and Holocaust studies expert Ross Siegel, who describes Gaza as a textbook case of genocide. Listen to Craig McIver, who I had on my show, the Katie Halper show, earlier this week. He's a human rights lawyer and was a top UN official who resigned from the UN over its failure to protect Palestine from what he also describes as a textbook case of genocide. Going back to Gaza, my president, Joe Biden, has said there's no possibility of a ceasefire. So I say to Joe, good luck in the next presidential election because you're going to need it.
Katie Halper, outstanding, and thank you. Please stick around because I'm going to give everyone a last word. Chris Williamson, Katie describes there the enormous eruption of support for peace and justice in Palestine, with American Jews right at the front of it, right in the leading edge of it. Huge demonstrations have taken place, not just in London, but all over Britain. And there's another big one coming up on Saturday. Speak to that, please.
Absolutely, George. I mean, the outpouring of support for the Palestinian people is absolutely unprecedented. And, you know, we're looking at the biggest anti-war rally, maybe the biggest rally actually ever since the rally against the Iraq war in 2003. Of course, at that time, successful in stopping the war from going ahead. And I know that you were leading the charge on that, George, and did more than I think anybody else to try and prevent that war from happening. And I think a lot of people were demoralized, actually, after we'd mobilized so many people onto the street to oppose that war. But I get a sense that the strength of feeling is even stronger now. Maybe that's because people are more aware now of what's happening. As you were saying, people are actually able to see in real time this genocide taking place before our very eyes. That's something we've never ever been able to do in the past, and that, I think, is driving the revulsion and the huge disconnect that there is between the political class and the people. And that's not just in this country. It's not just in the United States of America. It's right around the world. It's not just in the global south. It's everywhere. And whilst, we hear people say, well, we've got all this support. Netanyahu says there's all this support from the United Kingdom, from Germany, from France, from the United States. He might have the support of the political class. And yes, they have the levers of power at the moment, but they don't have the support, it seems to me, of huge swathes of the general public. We know, for example, in the United Kingdom, when Britain shamefully used its veto along with the United States of America to veto a ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council, 76% of the population want a ceasefire. And we're supposed to live in a democracy. What in God's name is going on when the strength of feeling is so strong and the political class are just riding roughshod over that? And I just sort of, think back to, obviously, when you were in Parliament, George, and other great anti-war voices like Tony Benn and others. But I'm particularly struck by, when Gerald Kaufman was there, and he wasn't necessarily of our political stripe. He was a Labour Party member, but he was a right winger. But on this issue, we walked in lockstep, didn't we? And I suspect that if Gerald were around today, he'd be expelled from the Labour Party for the position that he took, because he openly called, quite rightly, the Israeli regime Nazis, behaving like Nazis. And I remember him upbraiding a IDF spokesperson when she referred to the Palestinians as militants, and he drew an analogy between the Warsaw Uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and he said her description of those people were the words of a Nazi. That's exactly what the Nazis would have said, and indeed did say, about those brave Jews who fought back against the Nazis in Warsaw. And so I'm more hopeful now than I've ever been, in a way, that because the strength of feeling is so strong, it seems to me we're at a pivotal moment, George, that this could precipitate substantial, significant change. You were quoting Gramsci, I think, in one of your monologues recently, where the new world is struggling to be born. Well, maybe it's on the cusp of being born, because I think people are really sick to the back teeth of this horror that is happening and being endorsed by all of our politicians. And the final thing I'll say is, George, is the timidity of those who claim to be of an anti-war persuasion in the political class, in our country anyway, in the United Kingdom, who are very fearful, it seems to me, of speaking out. And when they do speak out, it's very lukewarm, in my opinion. It's very, very well talking the talk, but they don't walk the walk when the going gets tough. And it seems to me that people, claim to be on the left inside the Labour Party are more concerned about hanging on to their parliamentary careers than they are for actually standing up for what's right. And when you have a political platform, George, as I always used to say when I was a member of Parliament, and I know you followed this maxim, is you have to use that. You're, in my view, morally obliged to stand up for what's right, to stand up for what you believe in. Because what is the purpose of having a political platform for if all you're going to do is feather your own nest? And so we've got to put pressure on these politicians and make them understand. And I'm so pleased that this march is going ahead at the weekend, and that they didn't actually succumb to the huge pressure that was put on them. The Home Secretary writing round to every single chief constable in the country, talking about arresting people who champed from the river to the sea, arresting people for wearing a Palestinian T-shirt or carrying a Palestinian flag, people being thrown out of football grounds. This is outrageous, and people are seeing this, and people are, not prepared to tolerate that. And I said that was a final thing. This will be the final thing is those people that are saying it's disrespectful on Armistice Day to have this march are totally barking up the wrong tree. What could be more appropriate on Armistice Day than to march for an armistice, to march for a ceasefire? For God's sake, it seems to me these people are more concerned about glorifying war than they are in actually standing up and fighting for peace. And so, all power to the elbow of people. Anybody watching this who's in two minds about whether to come to London at the weekend, please join us. Let's make this a march and a rally to rival the great rally that George did so much to organise in 2003 against the Iraq war. But let's make sure that we follow through this time and succeed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. The Workers' Party will have a platform and speaking equipment at Hyde Park on Saturday, and Chris will be one of our speakers there. So the demonstration in London will not be going anywhere near the cenotaph, and is in any case hours after the commemorations at the cenotaph. It was all a lie for culture war purposes that the British Home Secretary to the Interior, Cruella Braverman, basically invented in order to get people hot under the collar that this was somehow disrespectful to the dead in World Wars I and II. David Clews, last observations, please, from you before I bring in Katie and close the meeting.
I think as well, as I say, I don't perhaps share the passion, obviously, for this cause. I'm just being honest. I think from my side, that the bombing of the children is just, it's utterly disgusting. And Chris is right. I mean, regardless of your opinion on this, everybody should be calling for a ceasefire and a stop to the killing. I mean, it's not even a controversial thing to say. It shouldn't be, but it shows you the state of the political class, etc. My concern as well is, though, this is just this is the description. Ukraine was an hors d'oeuvre. This in the Middle East is a starter, and what will be the main course and dessert? These powers that be, these warmongers, they want a war with Iran. They want to destroy Iran. They want a war there. They want a war with China over Taiwan. They want to destroy Putin. These people aren't going to stop. It is so concerning. This could so easily descend into World War III. And guess what? No, there'll be no winners in World War III. It'll be the end of the world. It'll be the end of humanity. So this really isn't a time for hysterics or nonsense, because this could spiral. This is very, very similar to the start of World War I, the way that just came out of nothing. No reason for it at all. And likewise, we've been talking as well about this ship build-up in the Middle East. How many wars have started over the sinking of ships? How many people, the Lusitania in World War I, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which turned out to be a lie, as did the Lusitania sinking, the sinking of the Belgrano, of course, and the Falklands War. Sinking of a ship is a very emotive thing. NATO are putting all these ships in the Eastern Mediterranean directly in firing range of Hezbollah anti-ship missiles. So, I'm hopeful this won't happen, but don't put it past that, how unfortunate Hezbollah have blown up one of our aircraft carriers, and now we have to go to war with Lebanon, we have to go to war with Iran. Never ever underestimate the sheer levels of evil, the likes of Lindsey Graham, John Bolton, all these. I mean, these people are lunatics. These are lunatics. It would be like taking a mass murderer out of prison and putting them in charge of foreign policy. No, we need to have intelligent, smart, reasonable people who yes, we will disagree. Yes, we will have falling outs. I am not a believer everyone lives happily ever after. But if we can just do our best to ensure humanity isn't wiped out, That would be a start. So please,
That
let's
would be a start.
pull it back.
David, thank you very much indeed. Katie, last word from you. As David put it there, two shafts of light there from David Clews. Calling for a ceasefire oughtn't to be all that controversial, and avoiding humanity being wiped out ought to be a commonplace shared by everyone across the political class. But it isn't. Neither is.
Right. I think it speaks to the mania and ideological insanity of these people who, on both issues, you're right, that if they were even self-interested, or if they even were interested in the things they claim to be interested in. So in the case of the ceasefire, I have no delusions that the people running our governments couldn't care less about Palestinians. That's clear to me, and it's lamentable and it's outrageous, and we need to expose that every chance that we can, that these people are dehumanizing an entire group of people. And these people who claim that the Nazis are this unique evil should be looking at the language that they're using to describe Palestinians and compare it to some of the Nazi language that was used to describe Jews. And the discourse around why don't these Arab countries take the Palestinians, as Norman Finkelstein pointed out the other day, is similar to the language that was used about Jews. And why won't other countries take them in? They're such, they're so deplorable. If they weren't so deplorable, they'd be taken in by other countries. But the other thing is that these absolute either idiots or cynics who don't call for a ceasefire, who say release the hostages now, as if Hamas is going to be listening to Amy Schumer or Michael Douglas or whatever idiot celebrity signs a petition saying release the hostages now. The only power that these people have, these American celebrities have, potentially could be making demands of the United States government or of Israel. And they claim to care about these hostages. Israel doesn't care about Jewish life. They claim to. Obviously, we know that. We know they don't care, couldn't care less about Palestinians. They're trying to ethnically cleanse them. They're murdering them. But they don't even care about getting out these hostages, because if they did, they'd negotiate, or they certainly wouldn't be bombing the buildings that they're in. And we're going to learn, I'm sure, just how many Israelis and hostages were killed by the IDF. I'm sure they're going to try to cover it up, but eventually it will come out, and we'll know that all these people wasting their voices to saying to Hamas, release the prisoners now, when they could be saying, U.S. government and Israeli government, actually get these prisoners released, or at least stop killing them in your bombings. These people are total wastes of space. They can't even do their own racist, eugenicist politics correctly, because they're too stupid to even do that. They don't even know how to save Jewish lives, because they're either idiotic or they're cynical. And the same thing with the a ceasefire in Ukraine going towards World War III. People like Lindsey Graham, John Bolton, these people have death wishes, and they should all locked up and sharing a cell together. They could share with Amy Schumer and also her cousin Chuck Schumer.
That would constitute cruel and unusual punishment.
Exactly. To all the people.
Which is outlawed in your constitution.
Right.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris Williamson, David Clews, Katie Halper, and all the people behind the scenes that made this public meeting possible. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us and asking you, the audience, to spread the message of this meeting here and no to NATO, no to war, far and wide. 1.3 million people watched the last meeting. Let's beat that this time. Take responsibility for spreading this footage to as many people as you possibly can. We'll be back, because the war and NATO are not yet going away. I've been George Galloway. You've been a terrific audience. Thank you for joining us.